Half-Life is a series that's rich in unused and removed content. However, I've been wary about doing a Betafied on the most notorious of the Half-Life games, Half-Life 2, up to this point. But after almost a year and a half of Half-Life Betafieds, and 5 years of Betafied as a series, I think it's finally time to dip my feet in the water of Half-Life 2. For those of you left uninformed, Half-Life 2 is notorious as being the subject of one of the worst, most wide-scale server compromises that has ever happened in the games industry to date. In 2002, a young German programmer named Axel Gembe found an opening into Valve's internal network, allowing him access to the entirety of the company's internal file systems, which, of course, included the entirety of the development repository for their most anticipated game at the time, Half-Life 2. In September of 2003, Gembe downloaded the entire main branch of Half-Life 2's code, as well as its compiled assets, among other files. The following month, some of Gembe's friends, whom he showed this exploit to, leaked these files onto the internet, nearly killing Half-Life 2's development, and, potentially, the entirety of Valve on a company level. So that's a very short history on the Anon HL2 leak, but that's not the topic of today's video. In addition to a 2003 build of the game, the hackers also downloaded and released a giant repository of well over 1,000 uncompiled map files from the game's development, from December of 2000 all the way up to July of 2003. This repository, dubbed the Worldcraft Map Pack, or WC Map Pack for short, contains everything in it from levels testing the features of the engine to full-blown chapters of the game from early revisions of development. Within these folders is a chapter from Half-Life 2's development that lasted from as early as 2000 to February of 2002. Described in the development book Half-Life 2 Raising the Bar, this section of the game was significant both in size and story importance. Folks, my name is Wolfclock, and welcome to Betafied, the show where we take a look at the unused and cut content of a game and try to figure out what it was, how it worked, and why it was removed from the final version. On today's episode, we're going to be taking a look into Half-Life 2's lost chapter, the Airex. Before we get started on the chapter itself, we need to discuss Half-Life 2's development cycle as a whole and understand some important things. All the time, I get comments, messages, and replies from people spewing incredibly uninformed misinformation about Half-Life 2, how it was developed, and what happened when it leaked as a whole. So let's cover some things that you may be misinformed about. Number 1. The Half-Life 2 leak did not change the scope or story of the game. This is one of the most common pieces of misinformation I hear about Half-Life 2 all the time, and there's really no reason for people to think this in the first place. For some reason, a lot of people believe that Half-Life 2's old story, including things like the Borealis, Kraken Base, Captain Vance, etc., were removed because of the 2003 leak. Literally just playing the leak shows that this is false. The Anon HL2 leak is just blockouts of the final game's levels, and even sequences like the teleport in Kleiner's lab has its final voice lines recorded. I just do not understand why some people think that this is the truth, when the real truth is out there and is so easily available. See, where I come from, saying something like this would get you beat up. Number 2. People seem to think that there was an entire finished game that Valve threw out in favor of the final version. This is also completely false. We live in a world where there are many examples of games that were nearly feature complete and were thrown out last minute in favor of being restarted for one reason or another. Some examples of this include Duke Nukem Forever's 2001 version and Time Shift's 2006 version. Both of these were games that were radically changed near the end of their development cycles for one reason or another. Half-Life 2, however, was not one of these games. A fully playable campaign from start to finish did not exist until March of 2004. The chapter we are going to go over today is an outlier in that it was actually playable from start to finish, unlike most parts of the game from these ports in development that was made. Number 3. People for some reason believe that the beta story was better. To which this I say, please, for the love of God, go read the story beats of pre-2003 Half-Life 2 if you believe this. Barney was gonna die for no reason, Kleiner was probably gonna die for no reason, the Borealis made no sense for most of the time it was in the game, and Eli was going to show the player a literal slideshow in a cave for God's sake. So, Those were a few things we need to go over before getting into the real meat of this video. Now, let's learn what the Airexchange itself was. Described in Raising the Bar, the Airexchange was a massive complex in the middle of the wasteland created by the Combine to, well, exchange the air of Earth with that of some manner of toxic gas. The reason for this was likely so that the Vitoi, or whatever their predecessors were, could breathe on Earth freely, at the expense of all of humanity being unable to exit their homes without, and I quote, coughing up bloody foam. The Airexchange would have been guarded by a group of conscripted human soldiers, led by Alex's original father, Captain Vance, and run majorly by what I suppose we could describe as conscripted synths, the horrifying stalkers. I have a few things to say about these guys in a little while, but what you need to know is that the stalkers of the beta were much more combat-based than the ones we see in the Citadel in the final game. The Airexchange was going to be found deep within the Wasteland, a part of Half-Life 2's world that is alluded to but rarely ever seen in the final game. According to Mark Laidlaw's vignettes for Half-Life 2's story, as well as the Wasteland Depot map in the leak, the player would board a train headed for the Airexchange for City 17 on the third day of their journey. The train would crash at some point before reaching the destination, however, and the player would be forced to head on foot towards the complex themselves. In early 2001, they would likely head through some manner of sewer or tunnel, judging by the early version of the Airexchange's starting level, whereas the later version from December would have seen them approaching from a ravine. Once the player infiltrated the complex, they would have met with Captain Vance and his conscripts, who would have let them into the Airex core, the central location of the entire building. Here, the player would have encountered several energy-based and air vent-based puzzles to solve in order to make their way to the center of the core, where they would have disabled the entire complex, ending the oppressive oxygen replacement for the humans of City 17 and signaling the beginning of the uprising. So, that's a basic overview of the chapter and how it was planned to have worked, but let's get into the juicy side of things. What was the gameplay of the Airexchange? Airex can be split up between two notable eras. Well, there's actually a third, but it's a very minor focus of this video due to how short it was. Anyway, the first era, dubbed herein as the Early Era, focused greatly on puzzles. The second era, dubbed herein as the Late Era, chopped off many of the puzzles in favor of a more combat-based gameplay loop. Let's go over both. First and foremost, we have the Early Era. The Early Era, which took place during early 2001, begins with the player entering into the complex underneath a bridge in an enclosed area. Once in, the player would ride an elevator up towards a clearing in front of the entrance to the complex. Here, they would have dropped down into a tunnel that leads into a large factory-type building. At this point, one of the new gameplay loops would be revealed, as the player watches a stalker press a button and pull up a bridge that they needed to cross. This is the tutorial section for one of the early era's defining puzzle types, the stalker puzzles. For several sections of the first few levels, the player would find themselves in situations where stalkers would be attempting to sabotage them by moving platforms and closing bridges, and, as a result, the player would have to kill the stalkers in order to ensure that they wouldn't hold the way forward closed. The second defining puzzle type of the early era was the air vent puzzle. Found in the old Viz groups of the Airexchange maps, as well as the Rough Puzzles map, the puzzles based around air vents are used all over the place, with several different functions per each. Funnily enough, a version of the Rough Puzzles map ends with a raising flag like Super Mario Bros. These puzzles, if you could really call them that, are essentially platforming sections, where the player would have been blasted around upon stepping over vents. One such rough puzzle even involved mixing the usage of vents with the usage of stalkers, by having a vent that was button-powered. Forget to shoot a stalker, and the player would be released halfway up the ventilation shaft, presumably hurtling back downwards towards their death. Our third and final puzzle type found in the early era are the electricity puzzles. Several sections of the chapter included large areas where the player would be avoiding blue electrical arcs on their way to their goal. This is first formally introduced near the start of the chapter, and is actually done alongside the stalker button puzzles. In the first example of these types of puzzle, we see electrical arcs going up and down past raising bridges that stalkers would attempt to lower while the player attempts to walk on. Many of these puzzles are also found in the Rough Puzzles level, and include a climbing puzzle where the player has to avoid electrical arcs while climbing up walls, and rushdown sections, where the player has to jump between different lanes to avoid large beams of electricity, similar in some ways to a section seen in Half-Life Opposing Force. So that does it for the majority of the early era, but how does the later era compare? Well, for starters, many of the puzzle mechanics were trimmed down or cut outright. For starters, all of the stalker button puzzles were removed entirely. There's no longer a section where you watch a stalker hit a button to raise a bridge. There's no longer a warehouse where stalkers are attempting to sabotage the player by dropping their bridges, and there's no longer a vent that a stalker can turn off underneath the player's feet, dropping them to their deaths. The late era has been simplified from a puzzle-based chapter to a combat-based one. Although there are still electricity and fan puzzles, their usage is a lot more defined and sparse. Additionally, the mechanics first appear late into the chapter, with both vent and electricity puzzles appearing in Airex 05. In the place of the early electricity and stalker puzzles, however, are combat sequences. Between early and late 2001, stalkers received a slight redesign, going from slower, more bumbling enemies to much faster, more agile ones that are harder to keep track of and shoot. With this, the old gameplay of shooting stalkers before they can pull a switch did not hold up against the much simpler shooting stalkers that are shooting at you gameplay loop. In addition to the early electricity puzzles getting the axe, the later air vent puzzles were also simplified greatly. Instead of the player needing to use the air vents to time their jumps and air strafe, the later air vent puzzles simply push the player from point A to point B, not too dissimilar to a simple train. The large air vent elevators that were seen in the early era have been removed completely as well. So to summarize, Air Exchange started as a puzzle-based chapter near the start of 2001, and then later morphed into a more combat-based chapter. So, let's take a look into what kinds of enemies we're going to see in it. This section needs very little introduction, so let's just run through things, folks. Our first enemy is one of the most common ones. It's the good old-fashioned Stalker. Stalkers are, of course, a character in the final Half-Life 2, and although they appear near the tail end of the first game, they're actually formally introduced as enemies in Half-Life 2 Episode 1. In the beta, however, Stalkers were much different during development to their retail counterparts. Starting out as an ambush enemy made to showcase the horror side of Half-Life 2, the Stalker is skinny, agile, fast, often dwells in the darker sections of the game, and can be deadly if the player is unprepared. The Stalker is equipped with a laser that comes out of its face, and depending on how much suit power you have, can either be a mild annoyance or a devastating threat. The Wasteland Scanner is a cut scanner type enemy that would have been found, big surprise, in the Wasteland. The Wasteland Scanner's uniqueness comes from its ability to group up with other scanners. Individually, Wasteland Scanners are able to fire grenades at the player. However, once grouped up in a group of 3, the Wasteland Scanners can join their energy together and fire laser beams at the player. Quite a unique and dangerous enemy if you're not prepared to fight it. Next up, we have the Combot, also called the City Scanner. Now you may be wondering, Wolfclock, what exactly is so dangerous about a City Scanner? I pop those guys in the final game for free batteries all the time. Well, my friend, the City Scanner of days long past holds a dangerous secret. These bots could fart! Literally, one of the abilities that was cut from the City Scanner was that they could spray a noxious gas at the player, inflicting damage and causing the HEV suit to warn the player of hazardous chemicals. Our fourth enemy type is the good old-fashioned Combine Soldier. As you could guess, a Combine-owned facility would have some Combine soldiers in it. These guys are pretty much the same as their final version, with the one difference I could really think of being that they have some different animations, like a kicking animation for their melee. Back to robots, we would also have seen some man-hacks in the later parts of the chapter. Although the NPC itself is pretty much identical in the beta to its final counterpart in terms of gameplay, its model and sounds were not. These guys are seriously nasty in the beta. If you thought the whirring sounds they make in the final game is bad, these guys used to play chainsaw sounds in the beta. Awful. Anyway, next up, we've got some various Zen enemies. Zombies would show up in the maps, as would barnacles. Interestingly enough, although there are no headcrabs in the map, there is a spotlight that's set to hate headcrabs. Perhaps this means that there were headcrabs earlier on in its development? It's either that, or an edge case for if headcrabs would pop off the zombies. Finally, we have what I think is one of the most interesting enemies, a literal tank. Found in an old Viz group for the first few levels, this tank would come out of a tunnel that the player was going to traverse, and would turn towards and fire at the player upon seeing them. Although this tank wasn't stationary like the one seen in Half-Life 1, it would follow a set track instead of being able to move completely freely. So, those are the enemies that can be found in the map files for the chapter. Of course, in total, the Stalker was going to be the most common enemy for the entire chapter. It's interesting to be able to look into these levels and see what kind of combat the developers were planning for this chapter. In upcoming sections of the video, we'll discuss how these things were used in the final game. But before that, we need to look at just a few more things. Airex was noteworthy as being very far along in terms of its art design. With this, the chapter had a number of noteworthy landmarks used both as goals and ways for the player to get their bearings straight. In this section, we're going to be going over the most major of these. The Airex Core. In the same way that City 17 has the Citadel, which the player can see anywhere in the city, the Airex chapter had the Airex Core, a giant metallic silo that serves as the goal for the player throughout the entire chapter. As early as the starting level, where the player is approaching the Airex facility, the core is visible over the top of the wall. Once the player has breached the facility, however, the core is always visible, looming over all of the buildings until the player finally takes the plunge into it during Airex 04. The Industrial Tower. Very similar in usage to the core, the Industrial Tower is one of the first major targets for the player, and one of the landmarks visible throughout the first part of the chapter. The Industrial Tower was a tall, top-heavy tower that would have likely acted as a base of operations for the Combine soldiers or administration stationed at the facility. It is the goal that the player is attempting to reach during the first half of the chapter, and once they get to it, they literally skydive out of a window into a giant pool, likely of wastewater or cooling system. That almost wraps things up for what the Air-Exchange chapter was, but we have one more oddity to look into before we move on to the second part of our video, and that is the enigmatic temp3.vmf. As stated at the start of the video, Air-Exchange lasted from 2000 to February of 2002. However, we've only discussed the 2001 versions of the chapter. What happened between December of 2001 and February of 2002? Well, we have a slight answer to this in the form of a map named temp3.vmf. Temp3 is the last of the Air-Exchange maps in the Worldcraft map pack, and is noticeably different to its predecessors. For starters, the most major difference in this version of the Air-Exchange is the sudden inclusion of trees. That's right, for some inexplicable reason, the facility made to replace air, the gas that all terrestrial life needs to be able to function, is filled with greenery in this version. No idea why. In addition to the sudden odd style difference, this version of the Air-Exchange, or what we have of it anyway, is significantly different in terms of what the actual complex is shaped like. Instead of having an alleyway to get from Airex 01 to Airex 02, we now have a large wall with a giant doorway that leads to the second level. The wall and doorway, by the way, are completely static. Indeed, in this version of the map, there is literally no way to get from the first section to the second. This map is a total mess. It's a bizarre hodgepodge of new assets plastered over incredibly old bits of the maps, with there being new buildings shoved on top of older ones. The underground sections of the map from early 2001 are also back for no apparent reason. All in all, the map is just odd. It feels like it was a rushed attempt to redo the layout of the map in a desperate attempt to try and save it before the chapter got the axe. So, that about wraps up everything in terms of what the Air-Exchange chapter was. It was a massive section of the game that took place after the Wasteland, but before the Arctic. It was a significant part of the Half-Life 2's story, and its destruction was a signal to begin the Uprising. So, why was it removed? Air-Exchange was a cool set piece. It had a unique design, a chilling name, and an awesome art style. However, the chapter had problems all over the place in terms of its level design, its flow, and its story in such a way that it was doomed to fail. Let's begin by looking at the actual level design of the Air-Exchange. And for this, I'm going to be looking at it through the eyes of Vitoi's late 2001 Air-Exchange mod. For starters, there's unused room all over the place. Starting off with Airex_start, the entire chasm is just sitting there without actually being used. Some Air Exchange mods attempt to utilize this section by forcing the player to start down at the bottom and climb their way back up, but the player's start in the map file itself shows that this was not the expected location for the player to start at. Moving into the building through the vent, we find multiple different directions to go, which all lead to the same place. These situations in the final game are ones where the correct path is usually easily discernible, simply by looking at which ways there are to go. Air Exchange, by comparison, is filled to the brim with dead ends, and is functionally directionless. Let's take this location, for example. Where am I supposed to go? Not this way. And not this way either. No, I'm supposed to climb onto this pipe, jump over this stopper, climb onto a roof, go around the side of this silo, enter this building, drop down from this ledge, and now we're across the fence. The rest of the chapter is filled with these directionless areas and weird dead ends as well. It's very difficult to navigate if you don't already know where you should be going. This directionless map design is the first of the reasons why this chapter got the boot. Next up, we need to talk about where the chapter fit. Where was the Air Exchange in the storyline for the game, and what problems did this include? Well, the Air Exchange chapter took place at the end of the Wasteland section of the game and just before the Arctic section. This already presents an issue, as by the time the player was done with the chapter, disabling the facility, they would somehow have to end up from this wasteland to a location with water, or a location already in the Arctic to begin the Borealis and Kraken base sections of the game. As you could probably guess, finding a way to get the player from the deep inside of a facility like this to the Arctic presents some difficulty. Additionally, let's talk about the actual use for the Air Exchange facility itself, replacing the air with toxic gas. By the end of 2001, the whole gas mask citizen thing was long over. As you could guess, for a game that was boasting a new facial animation technology like Half-Life 2, making the majority of the characters you meet wear masks that cover up their mouths entirely doesn't exactly mix well. By 2001, the idea of the aforementioned gas mask citizens was waning, and by 2002 it was taken out entirely. As you can imagine, this made the Air Exchange facility superfluous in nature, due to the story beat of the world being filled with poisonous gas getting cut. For these reasons, the superfluous nature of the building, the difficulty in fitting it in with the rest of the game, and the lack of direction in the levels, the Air Exchange was ultimately given the boot from the game, as the team worked towards designing a better, more easily followed section of the game in its place. So, what exactly replaced Air Exchange, and what lessons did developers use from it moving forward? Well, for starters, we need to look into what the actual use for the Air Exchange was, and to that, we can look into Half-Life 2 Raising the Bar. According to page 174 of Raising the Bar, the disabling of the facility would have been the signal to the rebellion to stage the uprising. As we all know, in the final game, the signal is given to the destruction of Nova Prospekt. Additionally, the last major area that the player traverses before arriving at the Airex facility was the Wasteland Depot, a level where the player would storm a Combine facility with a group of antlions. Sound familiar? Well, after the removal of the Airex, the depot in question was given a gulag. This gulag later transformed into the main focus of the section, with the depot being only a part of it. That's right, after the Air Exchange was cut, its role was filled by none other than Nova Prospekt. So, now we know why the section was removed and what replaced it. But what else was there? Well, if you recall the early era's puzzles for a moment, one of the roles of the Stalkers was reused in Half-Life 2 Episode 1. In Episode 1, we find inside the Citadel that Stalkers frequently disable Combine energy sockets that the player activates. This is very similar in nature to the way that the Stalkers in early Air Exchange would attempt to sabotage the player by closing bridges and turning fans off. If you ask me, I'd say that the way the Stalkers are used in Episode 1 is a direct evolution to how they were used in the early Air Exchange era. It's awesome being able to see these mechanics reused half a decade in between each other. And with that, we close our door to this monolithic set piece of a chapter. The Air Exchange is an excellent example of how game developers can learn from their own past. Although I agree that the Air Exchange needed to go, being able to see its influence years later is, to me, almost poetic, and shows exactly how we can learn from these things when we look at them with a careful eye. Thank you all very much for joining me today. If you enjoyed this episode, feel free to subscribe, and let me know what you thought about it in the comments below. I've been Wolfclock, and I will see you all in the next video, whenever it may be. Thanks for watching.